Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this morning. We're just going to let everybody join and then we'll get started. Just give it a couple of minutes. Good morning, everyone. I can see the numbers still ticking up, so I'm just going to give it one more minute before we get started this morning. Okay, well, there's still folks joining, but welcome to our economic commentary question and answer session. I hope you've all had a chance to have a look at the commentary, which we published yesterday. There was quite a lot of focus, obviously, on our different views about what growth prospects might be in 2022 compared to what we'd said in December. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the main messages of our commentary, which we published yesterday, and then take any questions you have about it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mairi Spowage, and I'm the director of the Fraser of Allender Institute. I've just seen that there's a request in the chat that we share the link to the commentary, so maybe David could do that while I'm introducing. I'm joined today by my colleagues David Eiser, who is going to help me answer your questions, and also I'm delighted to say we're joined by Douglas Farish, who's the head of tax for Scotland for Deloitte, and brings a really useful business perspective to lots of the questions you might have about what we've said in the commentary. So just to start, I'm just going to go through the main messages from our commentary that we published yesterday. It's quite a bumper edition, actually. There's quite a lot of analysis in there. And also alongside our economic commentary, we also published 4 perspectives. And I'm delighted to say that this time are our essay winners from our latest Economic Futures essay competition. There's some really great analysis in there about decarbonising our economy and the role how policymakers can look to tackle climate change. So have a look at those if you haven't already. Some really great analysis in there from our essay winners. But just to go through the main messages from our commentary. To start with the kind of positive stuff, you know, this is a chart that we've been looking at a lot over the last 2 years. When will our economy be back to those pre-pandemic levels that we saw in February 2020? And the Scottish economy now is above that level. It got above that level in November, actually, and then dipped down again as restrictions were reintroduced in December. But now it's 0.8% above pre-pandemic levels, which is about the same on the same measure as the UK. However, the optimism that this might have given us for growth in 2022, being above that level and ready to grow and hopefully catch up some of the growth that was lost over the period of the pandemic, has unfortunately been dampened by the inflationary pressures that we're seeing in lots of parts of the economy, affecting both businesses and consumers. So as we all know, inflation's at this 30-year high. The forecast published by the OBR last week expect it to get to around 8.7% by the end of 2022. And that at the moment is their view of when it will peak, and that it will sort of slowly come down over the period of 2023 but not get below the target until the end of 2023. And we are likely to see further increases in the bank rate over the course of 2023, with many analysts expecting it to go up maybe 2 or 3 more times over the course of 2022. And while there are a number of contributions to this inflationary pressure in terms of different products that consumers are buying, in the end, they're mainly related to energy. There are, of course, some inflationary pressures that we saw in 2021, which are about supply chain disruption and things opening up after the period of the pandemic. But in the end, just now, what householders are experiencing is mainly related to energy. All products obviously cost more to produce and to transport if energy prices are higher. And then we've got particularly high contributions from transport costs for householders, essentially fuel costs at the pumps, and for housing and household services that you can see there, which is basically about energy costs. However, there's also a significant contribution from higher rental and housing prices as well, which is affecting householders, which is quite interesting. So there's lots of analysis in the commentary of all of these different components. So if you're interested, have a look at the analysis that we've produced there. And one of the important things to consider about this is the distributional impacts of all of this. There's some analysis in there about how different households and the different income deciles tend to spend their money. And if we think about the energy price rises that are coming in from today, you know, those in the lowest decile of income are let to spend more of their expenditure on energy prices, and therefore this is going to have a bigger impact on them than those further up the income distribution. And it is likely to lead to some tough choices ahead. And we'll touch on some of the measures that, for example, the Chancellor announced last week to try and tackle this, or not, as the case may be. There's quite a lot of coverage yesterday on our analysis of our business survey and what businesses were telling us about how this might impact them. And whilst it's a minority of businesses, it's still a significant number who are telling us that they expect to reduce their operations as a result of higher energy prices. Many to a small or some extent, a small amount to a large extent. So that's quite worrying in terms of the capacity of businesses to grow over the course of 2022 if they expect to reduce their operations as a result. And these aren't the only challenges, obviously, that businesses are facing. Very tight labour market, shortages of suitably qualified staff, and potentially still businesses finding it quite difficult to get the supplies that they need, both because of price, but also due to availability, which is obviously going to drive up prices further. So all of these headwinds are leading to us downgrading our forecast significantly for 2022. You can see we're comparing there to the OBR's forecast for the UK. There are some Scottish specific factors that would lead us to think that the outlook for Scotland would be a little bit poorer than the UK as a whole, particularly around demography and participation in the labour market, which is why you kind of see this difference here. Also, the OBR's view is that in 2024, there'll be a bit of a boost as inflation comes back to more normal levels. And we've taken a slightly different view of the medium-term outlook there. Importantly, we looked at that graph at the start about the economy recovering to that pre-pandemic level, but there's huge sectoral disparities lying underneath that, and particularly those consumer-facing sectors, such as accommodation and food services, was not back to those levels, and it was still around 5% below pre-pandemic peak from February 2022 on the latest data in January. And the worry is, of course, that if consumers are cutting back on more discretionary spending, that it might be those sorts of sectors that are hit again in the sort of the months to come. A lot of these businesses obviously would be hoping for a more normal period of operation, perhaps with much, with basically no restrictions in capacity and the way that they operate. But if consumers are feeling the pinch and less likely to spend this money on discretionary items, this is obviously a concern for these businesses. We've done quite a significant amount of analysis in the commentary about inactivity. There's lots of discussion about, the sort of people leaving the labour market. And we've looked at the kind of medium term and the period over the pandemic, which is quite interesting analysis. There have been some long-term trends in inactivity, with male inactivity trending up a little as female inactivity trends down. But there has been this kind of uptick during the period of the pandemic, particularly in male inactivity. And looking at the data, it seems to be, well, it's a kind of across the board in men. It seems to be concentrated in those with a degree or equivalent or higher qualification. And there's a lot of people in the professional services industries and in the core public sector, which is quite interesting, who seem to be leaving the labour market. So again, there's lots of analysis in the commentary, but quite an interesting look at what's going on with inactivity and which sections of the labour market are choosing to kind of leave. There's also an uptick in young people tending to be more inactive, but that tends to be for the purposes of full-time education. So in the long run, that might be a good investment for the labour market if indeed they're getting the skills that the labour market needs. So as I say, some really interesting analysis in there. And I don't think quite we know what the new normal for the labour market will be and what impact that these sorts of trends might have on that. You'll have seen, if you follow the stuff that we put out on a regular basis, that we have put out some reactions to the spring statement last week already, and we kind of summarise these in the commentary. There's obviously a lot of pressure still on the Chancellor to maybe do more than was done at the spring statement. So we saw this interesting mix of tax policy announcements, especially if you take them together with the announcements that were made at the budget. So the fuel duty cut, which obviously doesn't really affect the overall rises that we've seen over the last few months, given they're kind of swamped by this in comparison to this 5p cut. And then we've seen the sensible measure to equalise the national insurance and income tax thresholds in terms of when we start to pay tax. But this narrative about the national insurance rise that we're seeing being to fund health and social care at the same time as raising the threshold and providing a tax cut, and then a further tax cut promise in 2024 for income tax, although of course that's devolved, and therefore it'll be for the Scottish Government to decide whether they follow suit or do something different. I think we've outlined, as many other commentators have, the surprise for the lack of targeted support on the cost of living crisis. A lot of the measures were quite expensive, but kind of thinly spread over lots of households, rather than being targeted at those who maybe are most in need. And this issue about benefits uprating, referencing the September inflation rate instead of the current inflation rate or the current projected inflation rate, was a little surprising to us. And the important thing to remember in a high inflation environment like we're in at the moment, if there's no announcements, it essentially means a decision to cut in real terms. So there was no more money for departmental spending, which means the money that was announced at the budget in the autumn goes less far. And therefore departments are going to have difficult decisions to make, and in particular it'll be interesting to see what it means for public sector pay policy over the spending review period. So I'm going to hand over to David now to talk a little bit about the local government elections, which are due to happen in about a month's time.
Thanks, Mairi. Yeah, so 5 weeks to go now until the local government elections, 5 weeks yesterday, in fact. And in many ways, it feels like this should be a kind of bigger, more significant event than lots of people perceive it to be. Local government's funding from Scottish Government is about £12 billion this year, and that's 1/3 of the Scottish Government's total resource spending. And local government uses that together with significant additional resources from council tax and various other fees and charges to deliver public services ranging from education to social care to environmental services to cultural services and so on. So really significant part of the public policy landscape. But engagement with local democracy is typically pretty low. Turnout at local government elections generally less than 50%. It was 47% in 2017, which is fairly typical. And surveys consistently show that people aren't particularly bothered about engaging more in local democracy. They don't feel that they can, most people don't feel that they can particularly strongly influence local services through their council, but most people equally don't seem to be particularly bothered about having more of an influence. So we saw some statistics for the latest good statistics we have from just before the pandemic, which show that less than a fifth of people feel that they can influence service delivery, and that was the lowest that figure had been since comparable data in 2007. So over time, people are less keen to be involved. They're less likely to say that they feel they can influence service delivery, and those figures have been trending downwards. It will be interesting to see whether the fact that local government did play quite a strong role during the pandemic in delivering support to businesses and to households, or certainly some sorts of households, whether that feeds through into any sort of rise in its profile or rise in turnout at the next elections. So what about local government funding? This is something that we often get asked about. Now, back in 2017, it was very much a story about cuts. The previous 5 years had seen substantial cuts in funding to local government of about 7% in real terms. And that was, a big part of the story around the election in 2017. Things have obviously been different the last 5 years, clearly because of the pandemic. Local government saw a big increase in 2020 in its funding from Scottish Government, and that was partly to offset lost revenue from non-domestic rates and various other charges and so on, but also to help local government deliver support to businesses, to vulnerable households, support various other public services, adaptations in schools, and so on and so forth. But since 2020-21, that support has gradually rolled back, and this year, 2022-23, when I say this year, I'm meaning the financial year that's just starting, local government funding from Scottish Government is set to be basically back in real terms where it was in 17-18. If you include various sort of bits of funding that the government transfers in from other portfolios, real terms funding for local government is slightly higher than it was in 17-18, but with that, local government is expected to deliver significant new commitments, particularly around childcare, health and social care integration, various other things. So the story, although it's not about cuts per se, it's still been a very constrained period in the last 5 years, financial settlement for local government. So what about the next 5 years? Well, clearly, local government is going to retain a really significant role in delivering some of the government's major policy commitments, mentioned childcare, but also educational attainment, climate change. Local government plays a big role in that, and in supporting the current cost of living crisis and some of the responses to that. The funding settlement is, though, going to remain really tight. We'll hopefully find out later on in May a bit more about what that funding settlement might look like for the next 2 years when the Scottish Government publishes its spending review. We'll have to see what that says. I think one of the big uncertainties, though, in terms of local government over the next few years is clearly around the Scottish Government's proposals to create a new national care service. It aims to have that up and running fully by 2026. And clearly that is going to have big implications for local government's role in planning and delivering social care services. We don't know, though, yet exactly what the implications are, but it's not surprising probably that COSLA is really reticent about this proposal. It's called it an attack on local democracy. And no presentation on local councils and funding and so on would be complete without the bullet point about tax reforms and the scope for tax reforms over the next few years. That's maybe something we can pick up in discussion. Okay, well, that was a very sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the issues around local government for the coming elections. So I'll hand back to Mairi.
Thanks, David. And the questions are coming in thick and fast already. So thanks, guys, the attendees for giving us such great questions. The first one is is sort of something that I got asked a lot yesterday when we were doing kind of media around the commentary, and that was how gloomy it all seems. And I was conscious that quite a lot of the survey work that we are relying on at the moment for businesses is from a couple of months ago. And we've currently got a survey in the field looking at what businesses feel like now and how optimistic they are for 2022. So I think I would just like to come maybe to Douglas first on this one to let us know how optimistic do you think the business space is about the prospects for 2022, and how much has that changed over the last couple of months as we both, I suppose, come out of pandemic restrictions kind of completely almost, but at the same time we face these economic headwinds.
Thanks, Mairi. David, that's a really difficult one, so thank you for that.
Sorry.
Our last CFO survey was at the end of Q4 last year, and that showed really promising optimism, appetite for risk, for growth, access to capital, and I thought it was a really positive start reading that coming into the new year. And then, of course, the dreadful events in Russia and Ukraine, plus the cost of living spiraling even before that added on, will obviously dampen that down, as I think comes across in your commentary. And therefore, I know your question was maybe about what's optimistic, but if I may just sort of chime in out. So there are clearly some sectors that are still thriving. So construction, definitely, professional services, financial services doing well, tech is still doing well. In some ways you can maybe see that because certainly tech is not, doesn't have a lot of employees oftentimes in startup phases, so they're not as troubled by wage inflation perhaps as other businesses. But then you've got a whole host, particularly those consumer facing, that are not recovering, and with a squeeze on income that's now and ahead of us, that's going to be really difficult for them. And every business is looking at their cost base again. They were very quick to react, and I think people are they now know how to react quickly, which is good, but they're going to have to react again, just as we thought things were going to be rather rosier.
Yeah, absolutely. I find it quite difficult as well. It's difficult because as I say, we are waiting to see what our latest survey says. And whilst the business space has been unbelievably resilient, to be honest, through the period of the pandemic, and very optimistic about the prospects of trading kind of more unencumbered from restrictions despite these headwinds. It's definitely difficult to know quite where that optimism is going to be in the face of rising input costs and labour supply shortages. So David, I'm going to come to you next, I think, and then you can ask me a question back if you like from one of the other questions in the Q&A. But another David has put in the Q&A the question that if the Bank of England continues on its rates rise course to squeeze out inflation and bring it closer to target, a knock-on effect will be to lower living standards or purchasing power, which may depress the economy. Is there a limit to how far it can go?
Yeah, I can't see that question in the chat.
It's in the Q&A. In the Q&A.
Oh, I see. I'm looking in the wrong bit. Yeah, technology always baffles me slightly. So sorry. This was a question about
the Bank of England. Yeah.
Bank of England.
How far can it go? Because that might depress the growth that we're seeing still further.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some big risks here. I mean, the and big uncertainties. The OBR seems to be being sort of fairly optimistic in a view that, arguably fairly optimistic in a view that we're going to have this spike in inflation to 7-8% this year, 4% next year, and then back to the sort of traditional 2% within target and manage that without, substantial rate rises. And as a result, those rate rises, whilst they will have a bit of a dampening effect on the economy, I mean, the impact of that is pretty small relative to the impact of inflation in eroding the real terms values of household incomes. I think the OBR would accept there's a lot of uncertainties around that. There's a big debate around the extent to which some of these inflationary pressures are, very short term, arising from these supply bottlenecks that we saw at the end of 2021, combined with this big supply shock following the war. But there's an alternative perspective that sort of says, well, this is actually the beginning of a more structural change in the global world order of things, where we're moving away from this recent period of liberalization, trade, low interest rates, low inflation, and we're moving into a world that's actually, in the longer scheme of things, a more normal world in terms of higher inflation and higher interest rates. So yes, I agree with the premise of the question. I think that if we see the Bank of England is definitely going to hope that it doesn't have to raise rates much, because if it does, that will definitely put further deflationary pressure on the economy. But at the moment, the perspective that the OBR and the Bank of England seem to be taking is that that won't be necessary, given the sort of fairly temporary nature of this inflationary spike. But yes, it could easily get out of control, I suppose, if this begins to feed through to wage settlements in a major way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gareth's got an interesting question, David. Can you see that one?
I think I'm still looking in the wrong bit.
Well, Gareth's asking about the thing I mentioned on the forecast.
Yes, yeah.
You want to?
Oh no, sorry, I'm looking at a different question from a Gareth.
Yeah, Gareth's got a few questions.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, the first question.
Yes, yeah, this is an interesting point. So the question here is, what's the impact of demographic change and labour market participation on the projections for Scottish economic growth, and in particular why that's slightly lower than for the UK as a whole? Do you want to pick up on that one then, Mairi?
Yeah, so it's kind of a point I made when you compare, our outlook with something like the OBR, and quite a lot of this is down to the sorts of components of growth. So you have to look at things like how much we expect productivity to grow over the next few years, but also what's important for growth is how many people you have in your country and how much they participate in the labour market. And one thing that's very different for Scotland as opposed to the UK as a whole, mainly driven by London and the South East, is the outlook for our population, and particularly our working age population. Now, this has always been the case, that population growth in Scotland has tended to be more slow than certain parts of England. And given that all of our population growth has been from migration in recent years, that's likely to be more constrained in years to come for kind of obvious reasons than it was over the period of EU accession. So because of this more constrained migrationary environment, the outlook for the Scottish population is pretty poor if you're after population growth, and particularly poor for working age population growth. So this kind of constrains the capacity of the Scottish economy to grow in that way. In addition, we tend to have higher inactivity rates in Scotland than the UK average. And as we discussed in the commentary, that kind of inactivity profile seems to have been changing over the last few years. And in particular, a concern is that there's more people who tend to be inactive because they have a long-term limiting illness or disability, and that rate is much higher in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. So that is a concern, and an interesting question when we're in such a tight labour market, and kind of obviously wanting to be making the most of that. Douglas, I don't know if you have a view from the business perspective about, I suppose, these changes we're seeing in the labour market, and what that might mean for, I guess, an employer's approach to attracting people into roles.
Yes, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting bit of the report, and obviously, long-term health concerns. We need to make sure that access to labour market for people with disabilities is as free as it should ever be. And I certainly know within my own business, we're looking at a new office. We're making sure that physically the space is as friendly as can be for people of all backgrounds. And then there's the medical aspects of making sure people get treated. Again, I have a slight fear that those people who have come out the labour market due to retirement will feel the economic pressure of the inflation, and we might see some reversal of that. And whilst that would be a sort of sad reason that they come out, the skills and experience that such a market can bring, if you can harness that when we think there's a skills shortage, I think is actually something that could be seized upon. I mean, I recall a very large retailer in the DIY space a few years ago embracing very successfully older employees, and I think we might find ourselves looking at that as a positive, silver lining, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we don't quite know where the chips are going to fall, I think, with all of these changes that we're seeing in the labour market, and how many of them will be temporary and how many will end up.
And maybe a note of optimism, you're absolutely right in the assessment on growth. But if you talk to the cities, whether it's the innovation side of things or Edinburgh's growth plans and what Aberdeen and Dundee are doing and beyond, then I have perhaps a naive optimism that we will see a rapid movement from people south into Scotland. We've seen a little bit of that actually, in sort of lockdown, and I know that the cities are ambitious that continues.
Interesting. Yeah, David, did you want to come in there?
Well, I was just, I mean, on the inactivity point, I mean, this is another one of these areas in terms of, is this a temporary thing or a more permanent thing? It's of course very difficult to know, but the OBR and the Bank of England even seem to have slightly different views on that. The OBR seems to think that some of that rise in inactivity is actually a permanent impact of the pandemic, and the Bank of England, at least at the moment, seems to be being a little bit more optimistic in the extent to which some of that will unwind and we'll go back to normal. But I mean, this just shows, I think, it's become a cliche in recent years that we're living in uncertain times, but there just seem to be so many uncertainties at the moment, and we just don't know what the impact of the pandemic in terms of long COVID and mental health problems and so on. We'll just have to wait and see in many ways. There's an interesting question here, Mairi, following up on some of the economic growth stuff. I don't know if you were at the Scottish Government's National Economic Forum this week. I wasn't. There's a question here from Alistair. Apparently there was a suggestion that economic growth should be treated as an overspill from collaboration between the various different players in the economy. And do we have a view on this? I presume this sort of means in respect of how revenues from devolved taxes are treated, but I don't know. I could be wrong about that. Were you at the forum?
I wasn't actually, but maybe Alistair can type more in the question to let us know exactly what you're referring to. But I mean, it might be about this sort of Team Scotland idea that was put forward in the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. The public, private, third sector need to work together to ensure that we achieve the sorts of outcomes that we want to see in Scotland, some of which is obviously going to be through generating good work opportunities so that people can, you know, increase their own prosperity and, you know, improve their lives and their living standards. And I suppose thinking about Scottish companies in the Scottish business space having a purpose which is much wider than just profit generation. It's about helping local communities and thinking about their sustainability. So if it's about that, you know, I think there is a real shift in the business space over the last few years, and maybe Douglas will tell me I'm wrong in this, in being much more focused on these wider outcomes, and that you know, the private sector is a key part of society. It's made up of people too, and you know, want to see these sorts of outcomes being achieved. Douglas, do you think that's fair?
Absolutely. I actually participate in the commission on Purposeful Scotland at the moment. So I think I mean, it's palpable. Every member of our staff wants to know what the purpose is and what their contribution can be to local society, and more broadly, a lot of it obviously gets aligned to sustainability and you know, the green journey, which is not surprising given the imperative around that. But I mean, very much, even though some of us work internationally and so on, we all live in communities, or children go to school here, we use the services, and people want to give and understand more than ever before, which I think is great.
I would agree with that. And we're working with lots of different organisations who, you know, both know it's important from a kind of involved in public sector procurement, or is what consumers want. But really, it's, I mean, to me, maybe I'm being too optimistic here in contrast to my earlier gloom, that, you know, it seems it's very sincere from a lot of businesses and organisations in Scotland wanting to be part of that sort of Team Scotland idea. David, there's quite a few questions on tax and local tax. So I just wondered if you could maybe take some of these. So David in the Q&A, another David is asking about that the resource spending review framework, the SG's framework, talked of investigating targeted revenue raising opportunities. And yesterday's City Centres Recovery Task Force talks about giving councils more revenue raising opportunities. And you mentioned, you know, local taxation reform of current taxes, but there's also obviously in the recent years been talked about new tax raising opportunities for councils as well. So David's asking if you have any thoughts on what this might mean in practice for firms or households.
Sure. So, I mean, clearly I talked a bit about sort of lack of a degree of sort of lack of engagement, buy-in with local democracy, and people come up with different sort of ways of addressing that. And one of the things that people talk about is giving local authorities more revenue-raising responsibilities, and also sort of more policy tools to deal with particular problems in their areas. So there have been a couple of proposals recently, both of which have sort of been stymied a bit by the pandemic. One of those was the idea of a sort of visitor levy, which Edinburgh in particular is pretty keen on. They do have visitor levies, are sort of fairly common in many other European cities. Related, or another one of these ideas is around the workplace parking levy. That's something that was being pushed more by Glasgow, certainly before the pandemic. And workplace parking levies, we actually have one or two in the UK already. Nottingham has a workplace parking levy. So these are some of the ideas. I guess some other things that have been discussed are things around congestion charging, things around vacant land taxes, and also just giving local authorities more local control, local power over non-domestic rates. These are all things that get bandied around. I mean, they all have potential advantages, potential risks. One potential risk with all of these is that you've then got a potential issue about inequities or inconsistencies between different areas in terms of their capacity to do things with these taxes or raise revenue with these taxes. And so that's always a consideration. And then the individual taxes themselves, as I say, I mean, there's various bits of analysis that talk about what the potential impacts could be on visitors or on the owners of vacant land, or on drivers and so on. So probably don't have time to go into all of that. But I mean, I think there's certainly merits in all of these, but some risks in all of these too.
You certainly see a little bit of that in America and the States, where they bring in taxes for a period of time to fund a capital program or a specific issue. Obviously, that would be very new for us, and I think your point about the risk of inequities, a real challenge.
Okay, and just keeping on the tax theme then, Ken in the chat actually is asking about the tax differential between Scotland and the UK, which I assume he means the income tax differential. What's the evidence that this is having an impact, potentially, I presume, on I don't know, Scottish economic growth or whatever?
If I could make a slightly a side comment, if it's the Ken McIntosh, I think it is. I know he's access to some very good insight in that my predecessor and good friend, is a retired head of tax from Scotland here. I mean, I'm not seeing it within the business communities that I work, but therefore, yeah, that's probably not the nub of the question. And I think the alignment of NICs at the lower levels is definitely very positive. But beyond that, I think I'll let Mairi and David perhaps answer on the economic impact.
So I think one thing that I can talk about is that there was a pretty comprehensive piece of work done by Scottish Government working with HMRC at the end of last year that looked at the entire universe of income taxpayers in 1819 to try and get a handle on did the change in tax policy in Scotland relative to our UK induce changes in behaviour amongst Scottish taxpayers that wasn't seen in other parts of the UK. And the answer that came back was basically the effect was very negligible. And that was the great thing about that piece of work, was that it was done by HMRC, and they weren't just using some small sample of taxpayers. They had the universe of taxpayers to look at. Now, I'm sure there's probably some perhaps anecdotal evidence around that maybe paints a slightly different picture, but that's the most comprehensive thing that I've seen so far. What will obviously be interesting is to see if that finding is replicated in subsequent years when divergence between the Scottish income tax system and the RUK tax system did grow further. 1819 was the sort of initial test of this divergence. Of course, the other interesting thing on income tax is going to be to see how the Scottish Government reacts in 2024 when the basic rate of tax is reduced in the rest of the UK, as per the announcement of Rishi Sunak last week. So that, I mean, just to recap, that cut in the basic rate of income tax won't apply in Scotland because income tax is devolved. What will happen is that the Scottish Government will get an increase in its block grant. That will probably be in the order of about £400 million. And the idea of that is that that's basically reflective of the cost of the Scottish Government reducing income tax by a penny on an equivalent band. So the Scottish Government will then be able to use that additional revenue to either make a tax cut in Scotland or to effectively bank the additional resources and spend the revenue. And it'll be very interesting to see what they do. I think that clearly, given the commitments they've made, they're going to be very keen in some ways to use that additional funding to fund these various promises that have been made. But on the other hand, they're very much, their mantra of the last 5 years has been this point that, you know, if you live in Scotland and you have below median income, then you will pay no more tax than you would if you were living in some other part of the UK. And I suspect that ultimately that will trump the argument to use the additional revenue for further spending. Is my take on the tax question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, anecdotally, talking particularly to sectors where people are more mobile across the UK. So just thinking about the original question, I think what we're hearing anecdotally is that the differential in tax isn't enough given other differentials to really be making a difference, you know, for businesses based across the UK. You know, the differences in wages, for example, between like London and Edinburgh and financial services or whatever is much more of a factor than, you know, than concerns around income tax. So that's generally what we're hearing anecdotally from businesses who tend to have quite mobile workforces. So. David, there's an interesting question which links to something that I mentioned in the presentation about the UK's government's decision about how they operate benefits. So we saw that the Scottish government the week before the spring statement announced that for the benefits that are fully within their control and their operations, they're going to uprate those by the current inflation rate rather than the September inflation rate. Although it is just ones that they actually administer. Do you have any insight into kind of what that'll mean for how that'll sort of interact with the UK government's decision not to do that for their benefits?
That's an interesting question, one that I hadn't thought about. So I guess, is there an extent to which slightly higher uprating of those devolved benefits in Scotland could have financial implications for the UK government? I think they certainly are not going to, given the range of benefits that we're talking about at the moment, it's not going to be enough of a financial impact for the UK government to want to think it's worth pursuing anything. I certainly think that that's the case on that.
It does
particularly
sorry, David.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's sort of, it's an interesting move, I guess, and these are the ones that, you know, there aren't block grant adjustments for, so that they have to be funded by the Scottish government. I suppose it's kind of a continuation of a trend of more generosity, maybe slightly, you know, wider eligibility, more encouragement of getting people to sign up for things. You know, what does that all mean as we move through the years potentially for the, I suppose, the sustainability of this approach on social security?
I mean, that's right. I think in some areas of policy, there's a very clear sort of direction of travel that the Scottish government is taking, and certainly social security and poverty is one of those areas. The government has some very clear targets. It's set out some very clear commitments on that. It's obviously got the flagship Scottish Child Payment Policy, and it's got these various new Scottish benefits that are replacing disability and sickness benefits in the UK, things like disability living allowance and personal independence payment being replaced in Scotland by things that are in principle not so onerous on the claimants of those benefits in terms of proving their eligibility. And these things are going to place significant risks on Scottish budget and spending plans. And there are various other policy areas as well where the government has some pretty clear sort of aspirations and commitments. I mentioned the National Care Service. Another area is on health and the catch-up plan around health, and there are some really big funding numbers going on that. In terms of, so I think there are these areas: social security, social care, health, where the government does have, clear direction of travel, clear aims. Some areas where it's less clear what its overall sort of vision and ethos is, and there's a question here, Mairi, that's maybe touching on this that you might want to pick up on, which is from another David again. Too many Davids as ever. But a question that's basically around, what is the Scottish government's sort of economic strategy, and what can it do? Is it doing the right things to improve the outlook for the Scottish economy? Do you want to?
Yeah, I suppose there's a lot of opportunities potentially, particularly as we look to decarbonise our economy, and discussing with a number of businesses who work in lots of different aspects of the development of new technologies, the recent Scotland leasing round and so on. There's a mixed view, I think, about whether Scotland's kind of can and is being a leader in this, or is sort of following to some extent. And I think those of us who've analysed the Scottish economy for many years would say that probably opportunities have been missed in the past, that we should try and grasp now, as we sort of look to develop supply chains and benefit both in terms of decarbonising our economy, but also economically from the amazing natural resources that we have in Scotland. The Scotland leasing round kind of focused on ensuring that those who won these leases committed to a certain amount of supply chain development and these sorts of things. And the focus was more on that in the Scottish one than in the UK-wide leasing round, I would say. However, whether that actually comes to pass, we will have to see. There's a definite issue in Scotland with capacity, in terms of just people with the right skills to be able to develop those supply chains, our manufacturing capacity, and so on. So there'll be a lot of investment and work that's required to be able to develop those supply chains to kind of really get the benefit and take these opportunities. I think as well, whilst developing supply chains in Scotland and benefiting and reducing economic leakage is important, we also have to decide what to specialise in. And we can't produce everything we need in the Scottish economy in Scotland. There's a reason why countries specialise in things, and we have to balance up the prices of things, and how much inputs will then cost, and also being seen as an attractive place to do business internationally, so that we get investment in Scotland. So there's a balance here. I think the crux of David's question, he's asking, is he kind of too pessimistic about our ability to grasp these opportunities? Perhaps you're a little bit more pessimistic than me, David, but I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of us actually seeing these developments have these benefits that are knock on. What I'm hearing from everybody every single organisation that we talk to who's involved in the sectors right now is capacity is the constraint. They just can't get the people that they need with the skills that they need to be able to fully take advantage of these opportunities. So it comes back to that demography point, that participation point, and to be honest, it links back to the whole system in Scotland of making sure we have the skills that we need in the places that we need them. So it's a big question. Can I actually ask, I'm conscious of time, and we've only got a few minutes left, and this has been quite a wide-ranging discussion. But Gareth asked a question about local democracy, and I guess, the local elections are soon, and I'm no expert on exactly the system for councillors, but he's sort of asking about the participation point, David, I think that you made. So there's quite a lot of wards, and the nominations shut, I think, the day before yesterday, and there's quite a lot of wards where there's not really a choice for candidates because there wasn't enough people put forward. So there'll be one council, there'll basically be the people who are put forward, so there's not much point in having them vote because the nominations were so poor. And I think whilst this is always a bit of an issue, I think it's particularly bad this year. So do the panel have any views on how we can improve participation in local democracy, given the data that you presented, David?
It's a great question. I mean, there's a couple of bits to this, aren't there? So I think one of the reasons why the electorate is less likely to engage in local democracy is that it's there's partly this point that it's not clear how much freedom or autonomy your council has to do things differently, but very often it's not really clear how your vote influences that either, in the sense that really strange things seem to happen with these local elections, so that in 2017, in fact, not a single mainland Scottish local authority was controlled by one party. You always have these coalitions, but sometimes it's not even the party that wins the most votes that forms the coalition. You have these strange coalitions between different parties. So it's really quite hard sometimes to see the link between votes and overall control, and then it's hard to see the link between control and actual policy differences or autonomy. So that's one set of the arguments. And then there's the question as well, which is specifically about how many candidates are put forward, and I think clearly the fact that we've talked about the fact that local authorities themselves don't actually have a great deal of autonomy. That presumably is one of the things that dissuades people from putting themselves forward as councillors, together with the fact that you don't get much by way of pay or reward. So there are problems not just in terms of the number of candidates that are put forward, but also the diversity of candidates. I think it's well under half of councillors are women. Interestingly, I've seen some stuff that shows that how do I put this? It's not that electors don't like women. It's just that there are far fewer women being put forward to be elected by the parties than you would expect. So there's a problem with numbers. There's a problem with equality of who's being put forward as well.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to know what the age profile is like as well, given the remuneration that we're talking about. But yeah, I don't know that, unfortunately, but something I'm going to look into. Douglas, we've got 30 seconds left. Do you have any thoughts? Are you a local councillor, Douglas?
No, but I did see a question in tax gap, so I'd be very happy to jump in on that.
Okay, well, we've got 30 seconds if you want to cover that.
Yeah, frankly, I think it's an embarrassment. We've got something like 17 billion lost a year in the tax gap. And actually a lot of focus seems to be more in corporate tax, but that makes the smallest proportion. The greatest part is income tax and associated taxes, and then VAT second. I was looking at, say, 100 tax charges actually 2 days ago, and the vast majority are in the 20s. Now, accounting and what you pay is not necessarily the same, of course, but I think the focus needs to change to massively reduce that. But it's a question of resource and ability to track it down. And you can imagine inflationary pressures will make people make poor decisions about some of their behaviours, unfortunately. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. There's still questions coming in, and great to see you all talking to each other in the chat as well. Interesting conversation going on there. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's been a really interesting and quite a provoking session. A lot of things to think about. We'll be obviously doing continual analysis over the next few weeks and months about the economy and what's happening. Look out for our next set of business survey results in a few weeks, which will tell us how optimistic that business space is feeling at the moment. But as usual, just follow our stuff on fraserofallender.org. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you to David and Douglas for joining me for a really interesting discussion. And we'll see you all again soon for our next Fraser of Allender webinar. So cheers and bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Mairi. Bye.